I knew something was horribly wrong the night the ocean lifted a shape that shouldn't have been able to lift itself. It rose without waves, without warning, just a smooth swell like something enormous, pushing upward from far below the rig. That was the moment I finally understood why the old crew kept repeating that there were 11 rules for crane operators working night shifts out here. They never said all of them at once, only the ones they thought I was ready for. I remember the first time I broke one, and the water moved as if responding to me. I still don't know what's waiting beneath the rig now, but I know it hasn't forgotten. The first time I heard Rule 1, never lower the hook after midnight, I was standing on the catwalk with a wrench in my hand and a headache from working 18 hours straight. I didn't take it seriously at first. It sounded like one of those old rig superstitions everyone repeats just to scare rookies. But the way Harlan said it made my stomach tighten, because he wasn't joking, and he didn't blink when he warned me. He just stared into the water like he expected something to rise from it. I remember thinking that he sounded less like a mentor and more like someone trying to confess a crime without saying the words. I didn't plan on being the one running the crane that night, but shifts change fast on a rig when someone twists a knee or gets sick from the fumes. The supervisor told me to take over just until sunrise, and I agreed without thinking, eager to prove I could handle night duty. The air was colder than usual, and the water below looked darker than any ocean I'd seen before, thick and heavy like ink. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself the stories were meant for other people, not me. But deep down, something already felt wrong, even before anything happened. The crane platform always vibrates a little, but that night the metal felt too still, like the entire rig was holding its breath. I kept checking the machinery, tapping the control panel, adjusting the lights, anything to distract myself from the quiet. Usually the wind hums across the pipes and whistles through the wires, but now there was only the low mechanical heartbeat of the generators far below. I had worked night shifts before, but this stillness made everything feel isolated, as if the ocean beneath us had swallowed all sound but ours. A little after midnight, I heard someone walking across the upper walkway, slow and heavy, but when I looked up, no one was there. I told myself it was the metal cooling, or maybe I was just tired, but the footsteps had a rhythm that didn't match shifting steel. They felt intentional, like someone pacing above me. I tried to ignore it while logging cargo, and for a moment I almost convinced myself it was nothing. But then I noticed the water directly beneath the platform. It wasn't moving with the rest of the sea. It was too calm, flat like glass, as if separated from the world around it. Around midnight, a radio call came through my headset, but instead of a voice, all I heard was breathing, deep and slow, drawing in air like someone standing inches from the microphone. I froze, staring at the panel, waiting for someone to speak, but the breathing only grew heavier, as if the person was leaning closer. When the line finally cut off, the silence that followed felt even worse than the sound. I tried calling back, but the radio stayed dead, and I felt a prickle crawl across my skin like static. The feeling didn't fade, not even when I ripped the headset off. I tried distracting myself with inspection work, but the more I moved around the platform, the more I felt watched, not from the rig, but from the water. Every time I leaned forward, I swore the dark surface shifted in tiny unnatural ripples, like something reacting to my presence instead of the wind. I kept wiping my eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on me, but no amount of blinking made the feeling go away. I eventually grabbed the railing and leaned out, trying to see myself reflected in the water. I didn't see my reflection. The floodlight was bright, but the water stayed pitch black. At around 1 in the morning, a container on the far end of the deck shifted on its own. It wasn't a small movement either. The entire metal frame slid a few inches, leaving a smear on the floor where it scraped. There was no wind strong enough to move something that heavy, not on a calm night like this. When I walked over to inspect it, I felt vibrations coming from beneath the deck. They were faint but rhythmic, like something gently knocking from underneath the metal plates. The sound made the back of my neck tighten, and I backed away without finishing the inspection. I tried calling the main deck again, but the line kept cutting out before anyone answered. Eventually, the panel lights flickered, dimming enough to make shadows stretch farther across the cranes and containers. I kept telling myself none of this mattered, as long as I didn't touch the controls, as long as I didn't activate anything, as long as I didn't lower the hook. But then out of nowhere, the crane's winch began to spool down on its own. The thick cable uncoiled like a metal serpent, lowering the hook toward the water with a steady mechanical groan. I stumbled back, staring at the controls, certain no one had touched them. My first instinct was to hit the emergency stop, but when I slammed my hand against the button, nothing happened. The winch kept lowering, slow and deliberate, like someone was manually operating it from another panel. The hook descended past the guardrails, hanging above the unmoving water that waited below it. I shouted into the radio, hoping anyone was still awake to hear me, but the only response was another burst of heavy breathing that sounded too close, too deliberate, too aware of me. I dropped the headset again, feeling panic clawing inside my chest. I ran to the manual override box, pulling the latch open so hard it slammed against the frame. Inside, everything looked normal. No sparks, no corrosion, no malfunction. Yet the cable kept lowering. It was moving slower now, almost teasingly, and for a moment I thought I saw movement beneath it. Not the water. Beneath the water. I leaned over the rail despite every instinct screaming not to, and the surface shifted in a slow outward ring, like something enormous exhaled directly below the hook. The shape wasn't clear, but the depth changed, darkening the water as if something was rising. I turned back to the controls, desperate to stop the descent, and that's when I saw the silhouette on the far walkway. It stood completely still, tall and narrow, as if its limbs were longer than they should have been. The floodlights flickered, cutting its outline in and out of visibility, but its head was tilted toward me the entire time. I thought it was a crew member at first, but then it stepped forward, and the way it moved wasn't human. It didn't step so much as slide, and each shift of its body made the walkway beneath it tremble like it was carrying too much weight. I didn't think, I just lunged back to the panel and hit every switch, every lever, every lockout command I knew. The hook jerked, slowed, and finally stopped a few feet above the water. I backed away, shaking, watching the cable sway gently as if touched by a breeze I couldn't feel. When I looked up again, the silhouette was gone. The walkway was empty. Only the metal quietly shuddered where it had been standing moments before. The water beneath the hook began to settle again, but not naturally. It was too still, too expectant, almost disappointed. I forced the kill switch one last time, and everything on the platform fell silent. The lights stopped flickering, the radio died completely. Even the generators sounded distant. I didn't move for a long time, terrified that any motion would draw whatever was beneath me closer. When I finally gathered the courage to step away from the controls, I kept my eyes on the water, watching for any sign of movement. The moment I reached the exit door, I heard something behind me, a deep shift of weight, like something large settling onto the deck. I didn't turn around, I just walked off the platform, slow and careful, feeling the metal vibrate beneath my boots. I didn't breathe until I was back inside the main rig, where the noise of machinery felt like a shield around me. I never reported what I saw. I didn't think anyone would believe me, and maybe I didn't want them to. But I understood something that night, something Harlan hadn't said out loud when he warned me. Midnight out here isn't just a time, it's a threshold, and something waits beneath it, listening for anyone foolish enough to break the rule. I first learned Rule 2. Never answer a voice calling your name from the water. The morning after that night, on the crane platform, when the supervisor found me staring at the ocean like it might stare back, he didn't mock me or accuse me of losing it. Instead, he put a hand on my shoulder and asked, very quietly, if I had heard anything. The way he said it made something cold twist in my stomach, because I suddenly knew this wasn't just a warning. They had all lived pieces of it. He told me if I ever heard my name drifting up from the dark, I should keep my mouth shut, no matter how real it sounded. I didn't expect to need that rule so soon. But the sea doesn't care what you're ready for. The night after the crane incident, I couldn't sleep, not even with the generator humming and the bunks rattling from the wind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hook lowering on its own and the shadow on the walkway turning toward me. Eventually, I dragged myself out of bed and walked to the lower deck, telling myself fresh air would help. The water was calm again, too calm, and in the faint moonlight, it looked stretched smooth like a dark sheet pulled tight over something underneath. I leaned against the railing, trying to control my breathing, and listened to the usual noises of the rig: metal shifting, cables whining far above, the creak of the tower swaying gently with the waves. For a moment, I almost convinced myself everything was fine, but then I noticed something strange. The waves weren't pushing against the rig anymore. They were pulling away from it, slowly, inch by inch, as if something below was inhaling, drawing the water downward into the deep. The air around me changed too, becoming warmer and heavier, like someone breathing softly against the back of my neck. I rubbed my eyes, trying to steady myself, and that's when I heard it. My name. Quiet at first, almost too soft to catch, like someone whispering through a cracked door. I whipped my head around, expecting to see a crewmate behind me, but the deck was empty. I stood still, listening, thinking maybe it was the wind funneling through the metal. Then it came again. Clearer, closer. The voice sounded exactly like someone I knew. My brother, but that was impossible. The sound didn't come from the deck or the stairwell. It drifted up from the water. My whole body locked up. An instinct told me to respond, to call back, to demand who was down there. But the memory of the supervisor's warning clamped around my throat. I forced myself to step back from the railing. I told myself it was just fatigue, stress, too many shifts without rest. But the voice came again, and this time it sounded desperate. It didn't simply call my name. It begged. The tone cracked, like someone trying to keep their head above the surface, like someone drowning. I could almost feel the panic in it, and something inside me twisted painfully with the urge to help. The voice grew louder, as if rising with the tide, even though the water wasn't rising at all. My skin prickled with cold, and my legs shook in a way I couldn't control. Every sense screamed at me that someone was in danger, that I had to answer, that I couldn't leave a person drowning in the dark. But another part of me, the part that had seen the hook lowering itself, knew there was no one in the water. The rig sensors would have picked something up. The cameras would have detected movement. Whatever was below me wasn't human, no matter how perfectly it copied my brother's voice. I forced myself to back away, step after step, gripping the railing behind me until my knuckles cracked. The voice changed as I retreated. It didn't just get louder, it grew angry, like I was ignoring someone who had every right to demand my attention. It called my name again, sharper this time, stretched too long, like whatever was saying it didn't understand the rhythm of it. The tone twisted into something unfamiliar, something that scraped against my ears. I felt that same shift in the air, that heavy warmth, as if the water was leaning toward me. When I reached the inner door, I turned the wheel so fast I nearly jammed it. As the lock released, I heard the voice snap into a different pitch, lower, deeper, almost mocking. It repeated my name one last time, slow and deliberate, each syllable sinking like a stone. I slipped inside and slammed the door behind me, bracing my weight against it, even though I knew the water couldn't open it. I didn't move, not for minutes, maybe longer. When I finally gained enough breath to listen again, the voice was gone, leaving only the distant hum of machinery vibrating through the walls. I didn't tell anyone the next morning, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what the supervisor would ask. Did I answer? And I didn't want to hear what would have happened if I had. Instead, I stayed quiet, sipping burnt coffee in the break room while the crew shuffled past me, all of them looking equally tired. I wondered if anyone else had heard their name called in the night, and if they were keeping quiet for the same reason. Harlan caught my eye once, just for a second, and I knew he understood without asking. Later that day, I was assigned to check the lower maintenance corridor near the ballast pumps. It was cramped, humid, and filled with pipes that throbbed with pressure. The moment I stepped inside, I felt water dripping from the ceiling. At first I thought it was condensation, but the droplets were warm, not cool. They hit my shoulder and rolled down the side of my neck, and something about that warmth felt wrong, like breath. The corridor lights flickered, and I saw a shadow at the far end, long and thin, stretching across the wall even though nothing stood there to cast it. I forced myself to walk forward, keeping one hand on the railing and the other near my radio. The deeper I went, the louder the machinery grew, building into a steady vibration through the floor. But mixed within that rumble, I heard something else, soft, faint, winding between the metal sounds like a thread. My name, whispered gently, almost lovingly, as if waiting for me to respond. I shut my eyes, pressing my back against the wall, fighting every instinct screaming at me to call out. The voice drifted closer, not echoing, not distorted, just perfectly clear, like someone standing inches from my ear. When I opened my eyes, the shadow on the far wall had changed. It wasn't long and thin anymore. It was wider, crouched, as if something had lifted itself halfway through the grate. The lights flickered again, and the shadow twitched, stretching toward me even though nothing visible moved. The whisper turned into a low murmur, repeating my name over and over, each time sounding more expectant, more eager, as if waiting for the one wrong breath that would give me away. I forced myself to walk backward, never turning, never blinking, until I reached the exit. I didn't breathe again, until I climbed the ladder and felt fresh air hit my face. The moment I reached the main deck, the whispering stopped, the shadow vanished. The warmth faded, replaced by the familiar cold wind sweeping across the platform. I walked to the railing again, gripping it until my arms ached, staring down at the water. It was calm, too calm, and for a moment, I thought I saw a ripple forming below me, a slow circle spreading outward, like something sinking beneath the surface. But the voice didn't return, not that night. I still don't know what the ocean wants from us out here. Maybe it isn't the ocean at all. Maybe it's something beneath it, older than our machines, older than our rules, older than anything living on the surface. But I believe one thing more than anything now: whatever calls our names in the dark doesn't do it to be heard, it does it to see who will answer. I learned about Rule 3, never look directly into the water, once the cargo is in motion on my 4th night shift, but I didn't understand why until everything went wrong. The rule felt strange to me at first, almost superstitious, and I remember thinking the older operators were just trying to mess with the new guy. But after what happened during Rule 2, the shadows moving beneath the surface felt different, heavier somehow, like they were waiting for me to slip. When the supervisor reminded me of Rule 3 before I stepped out on deck, his voice sounded tighter than usual, as if he wasn't giving advice but a warning he expected me to ignore. I told myself I could handle anything the ocean threw at me, but deep down, I already feared I wouldn't make it through this night. The deck lights were dimmed for night operations, letting only a pale glow cut across the steel grates beneath my boots. The rig hummed around me, the sound steady but uneasy, like it was trying to hide something beneath its own breathing. I tried to focus on my checklist, but every time I glanced toward the water, I felt that same pressure in my chest that had started earlier, like someone unseen was leaning close, waiting for me to slip. The crane's arm stretched over the dark waves, its cable swaying gently as if stirred by something other than the wind. I told myself I wasn't going to look down once the cargo moved, that I'd learned from the last rule, but the ocean has a way of drawing your eyes, no matter how hard you fight it. I waited for Tyler, the skeptic, to arrive because he was always late, always cocky, always convinced nothing on this rig could scare him. When he finally walked up, he had that same smirk, like the whole world was a game and he was winning. He threw his helmet down on a container and asked if I was still shaken from earlier, but I didn't bother answering. He didn't believe in the rules, thought they were just a way to keep us paranoid and obedient. The thing was, Tyler kept breaking little rules without consequences, so part of me wondered if maybe he was right, maybe nothing was really out there. But every time the water shifted, every time the crane cable swayed without wind, I remembered I'd already seen too much to doubt. We hooked the straps around the next container, a rusted block no bigger than a storage locker, but heavy enough to break bones if mishandled. I double-checked the locks twice, earning a laugh from Tyler, who told me I was behaving like something down there gives a damn about cargo. I didn't bother explaining that I wasn't checking for the cargo, I was checking for myself. When the supervisor's voice crackled through the radio telling us to begin the lift, I swallowed hard, gripping the controls while Tyler gave a casual thumbs up. The container lifted smoothly, rising off the deck with a low metallic groan that vibrated through the floor and into my legs. I tried to focus on that sound instead of the water below, forcing myself to keep my gaze locked on the arm of the crane. But the moment the cargo shifted into its slow swing over the water, something inside me twitched, an instinctual urge to look down, even though I knew I shouldn't. The waves were quieter tonight, too quiet, and the air felt thicker, humid in a way that clung to my skin. I heard a splash beneath the container, soft but deliberate, like something had surfaced just long enough to peek at what we were doing. Tyler noticed it too because he turned his head, curiosity sparking in his eyes. I grabbed his arm before he could step closer to the edge, telling him not to look, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged me off with a scoff, reminding me he didn't buy into any of this rule nonsense, but he didn't lean over again either. That small hesitation told me he had heard something he didn't want to admit. The wind picked up suddenly, pushing at the swinging container, making it drift farther out than usual. I clenched my jaw and tried to compensate, shifting the controls carefully, inch by inch, but the cable jerked as if something pulled from below. The sudden force made me stumble back, my hand slipping on the lever before I managed to stabilize it. Tyler stepped forward, ready to help, but I yelled at him to stay still because I knew if he looked down now, even just a glance, something would go wrong. My heart beat so loud I could barely hear the supervisor asking what was happening over the radio. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just focused on the cable, watching it twitch unnaturally as if caught on an unseen hook. The splash came again, this time louder, sharper, like something breaking the surface with purpose. I felt my eyes start to drift toward the sound, pulled like a magnet. My body wanted to look, wanted to see what was down there disturbing the cargo, wanted to confirm I wasn't imagining the movement. But my mind remembered the rule and held me back. Tyler didn't share that restraint. I saw him from the corner of my eye, the way he stepped closer to the rail, his posture stiffening as if something was calling him. He leaned over, just enough for the deck lights to catch the tension in his shoulders. I shouted at him to stop, but he didn't seem to hear me. Or maybe he did, and chose not to listen. Then he froze, completely, like someone had pressed pause on him, his head tilted slightly, eyes locked on the water below, and his hand trembled against the railing. I shouted his name, but he didn't move. The crane cable jerked again, violently this time, pulling the container lower as though something massive tugged it from below. The entire rig groaned under the strain. I fought the controls with all my strength, trying to reverse the lowering motion, but the system resisted, the motor whining as if locked in a struggle against an unseen force. Tyler suddenly stepped back, but not in a normal way. It was like he stumbled away, not choosing to, but forced. He hit the deck hard, gasping, scrambling backward until his back hit a stack of pipes. His eyes were wide, unfocused, the expression of someone who had seen something he couldn't make sense of. I ran to him, grabbing his shoulders, shaking him gently, trying to get him to say something. But all he managed was a whisper, broken and uneven, saying he thought he saw someone staring back at him from below the surface. The container suddenly snapped upward, the tension on the cable releasing so abruptly it made me jump. I rushed back to the controls, steadying the load again, making sure it hung still. Tyler refused to go near the edge, and I didn't blame him. The supervisor's voice kept demanding updates, but I didn't answer until the cargo was secured back onto the deck. Only then did Tyler start talking again, slowly, still shaking. He described a face below the waterline, pale, unmoving, floating just beneath the surface, like it had been waiting for someone to look down. He said the face didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't drift with the waves. It simply stared. By the time we pulled him back inside, he was pale and sweating, whispering that he thought he saw lips moving beneath the surface. He said it looked like the face was trying to speak to him. I didn't know what to believe, but something about the way his voice shook told me it wasn't imagination. Whatever was in the water had wanted him to look, and now that he had, I feared it wasn't finished with him. When the shift ended, Tyler refused to walk alone, glancing back toward the dark ocean every few seconds. He didn't make jokes. He didn't roll his eyes at the rules anymore. As we stepped into the corridor leading to the crew quarters, he grabbed my arm suddenly, lowering his voice. He said the worst part wasn't the face itself. It was the moment right before he backed away, when he thought he saw another face rising beneath the first one. A second face, closer and smiling. We made it inside, but Tyler didn't sleep. I didn't either, because if something in the water could pull the cargo cable with that much strength, then what else could it pull? The next shift started in less than 2 hours, and neither of us felt ready, especially when the supervisor told us we'd be working the south side of the rig next, a place the older workers avoided, even during the day. And that's where the next rule begins. I learned why Rule 4. Never work the south side alone after one of the faces appears existed. The moment Tyler and I stepped onto that part of the rig, the air felt heavier there, almost thick enough to taste, like the ocean below had been holding its breath all night, just to meet us. I kept replaying the moment Tyler saw the face in the water, reminding myself, this rule wasn't superstition anymore, it was survival. Even Tyler, who used to laugh at every warning, stayed close to me, refusing to let more than a few steps come between us. The supervisor's reminder of Rule 4 echoed in my head as we moved along the walkway, both of us pretending we weren't listening for something to rise beneath the waves. The south side didn't look any different at first, but there was something wrong about the darkness there, like it gathered too easily in the corners and refused to leave. The lights flickered even though the bulbs were new, and the shadows stretched longer than the poles that cast them. The waves below weren't moving normally either. They rose and fell in slow, unsettling patterns, as if something enormous shifted underneath. Tyler kept glancing over the railing, not down toward the water, but at the space between the rig and the ocean, like he expected someone to climb up from it. I noticed he walked with his shoulders tense, his jaw tight, his usual confidence replaced with silent dread he didn't want to talk about. We were assigned to lift a crate of hydraulic parts, sitting dangerously close to the rail, leaning just enough to worry the supervisor. He wanted it secured before someone tripped over it or the wind pushed it off. I could tell he didn't want to be the one giving the order, his voice shaking slightly as he told us to handle it quickly. Tyler muttered something about how he'd rather deal with the crate during the day, but we didn't have a choice. The shift was ours, and the south side wasn't going to get any less strange the longer we waited. I checked the straps, making sure everything was tight, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I kept forcing myself to breathe slowly, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was standing behind us, even though we were alone. As soon as I started operating the crane, the air turned colder, sharp enough that I could feel it through my gloves. The crate lifted smoothly at first, rising a few feet off the deck, swaying gently as the rig rocked, but then the cable trembled again. The same unnatural vibration from earlier, like something brushed against it from below. Tyler stepped closer to me, whispering that he heard something, but I kept my eyes on the crate, refusing to look anywhere else. The waves sounded wrong beneath us, rising in slow, heavy surges that pushed air upward, like the ocean was exhaling with force. Tyler asked if I noticed the shift in temperature, and before I could answer, we both felt a faint pressure on our ears, similar to the sensation of going underwater. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the crate, but then I saw Tyler's face twist in confusion. He slowly turned his head toward the water, not looking down but at the surface from a sideways angle, like something moved in his peripheral vision. I grabbed his wrist immediately, reminding him we weren't supposed to work alone on this side for a reason. He nodded shakily, keeping his gaze forward again, but his breathing had quickened. I adjusted the angle of the crane to swing the crate toward the storage platform, hoping to finish the job before anything else happened. But then the cable jerked again, harder this time, pulling the crate sideways toward the ocean. Panic shot through me as I fought the controls, trying to stabilize it before the weight shift damaged the arm. Tyler backed up a few steps, staring at the cable like he expected it to snap. The crate swung over the edge for a moment, dangling dangerously above the water, before I finally managed to correct it. The metal groaned under the force, and the motor whined like it was struggling against something stronger than the wind. I tried to convince myself it was just turbulence or a sudden swell, but the vibration in the cable felt too deliberate, almost like fingers brushing along the steel. Tyler whispered something about seeing movement below, but I told him not to look directly, not even accidentally. The moment the crate settled onto the platform, the deck beneath us trembled, not enough to knock us over, but enough to make us freeze. Tyler turned his head slowly, listening. I could hear it too now, a soft shift beneath the metal grates, like water thickening under pressure. The south side had always been the deepest drop from the rig to the ocean floor, and in that moment, it felt like something far below was rising. Tyler backed up toward me, his voice low and shaky as he asked if I saw the reflection in the water earlier. I told him no, and he whispered that he wasn't sure the reflection he saw was his own. We started walking back toward the center of the rig, staying close, refusing to separate even for a second. But as we reached the middle of the walkway, a faint shape appeared in the water below, just for a second, just long enough for the surface to distort around it. A pale blur, too large to be a person yet too defined to be a trick of the light. Tyler froze, and I had to grab his arm again to force him forward. I didn't look down. I couldn't. I kept my eyes on the bolts in the walkway, counting them just to distract myself until we reached safer ground. Before we stepped back inside, a voice crackled over the radio, one of the night crew from the far end of the rig. He said he saw something rise, almost level with the walkway on our side, and asked if we noticed anything. Tyler took the radio from my hand and said we were heading in, but his voice was hollow, terrified. When we finally reached the door to the interior corridor, he paused and looked back at the dark stretch of the south side. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something. Instead, he slammed the door shut behind us and locked it, even though that lock wouldn't stop anything that could rise from the water. We walked back to the crew quarters in silence, listening to the hum of the rig shift in uncomfortable patterns. Tyler didn't joke, he didn't smirk, he didn't challenge anything. I said, he kept glancing over his shoulder like someone was following us, even though the hallway was empty. When we reached his room, he hesitated before going in, asking me to leave my door unlocked in case something happened. I agreed, even though I knew neither of us planned on sleeping. But just as he stepped into his room, he froze again, staring at the small porthole window on the wall, not because of what was outside, but because there was condensation on the inside of the glass, a perfect handprint, and the fingers were too long to be human. Tyler didn't speak, and the night was far from over. I discovered Rule 5. Never enter the machinery room. After hearing whispers from below, during a night when the rig seemed almost alive, and the whispers came before I even realized they existed. They started as a faint vibration through the floor, almost drowned by the hum of the generators. But soon they formed into syllables I couldn't comprehend. At first I thought it was fatigue, like my mind was fraying from too many nights awake, but there was a pattern in them, a rhythm that matched neither the waves nor the machines. Tyler froze beside me, normally brash and fearless, and I saw in his eyes the same recognition I felt. The whispers were not just noise. The supervisor had warned about this rule countless times. but hearing it firsthand made it clear that the warning was never enough. Survival required strict obedience. The machinery room was more menacing at night than I ever imagined. Towers of generators and pumps loomed over the metal grates, their vibrations transmitting deep into the floorboards and straight into your bones. Tonight the air carried a metallic tang, thick and heavy, like breathing through rust and oil, and every exhale felt too warm against the chill from outside. The whispers moved with purpose, traveling along the piping, sliding across walls, and twisting around the corners as though they were guided by an unseen hand. Tyler beside me whispered that I should leave it alone, but I knew we couldn't ignore it. It wasn't curiosity, it was compulsion, pulling us toward the very thing we were warned to avoid. Each syllable seemed to pierce through my chest, forcing me to acknowledge the danger before I was ready. I stepped onto the grated floor, my boots clanking softly, each echo seeming to awaken something below the machinery. My flashlight cut through the darkness, bouncing off the steel frames, but the shadows remained stubborn, refusing to submit to the light. The whispers grew louder, responding to my movement in ways that chilled me to the core. They weren't random, they followed my steps, wrapping around my ankles and crawling up the metal beams. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet I felt a pull, a need to understand them before they consumed us. Tyler stayed at the doorway, nervously shifting, glancing at the pipes above, whispering that this was a mistake, but the rule didn't exist to prevent mistakes. It existed to prevent death. The deeper I walked, the stronger the vibrations became. The machines themselves seemed alive, thrumming with a low, deliberate pulse, synchronized with the whispers that had begun to form words. I could feel the air condensing in front of me, forming shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. A droplet of water fell from above, and when it hit the metal, it created a ringing note that reverberated through the room like an alarm. I froze mid-step, flashlight trembling in my hands, trying to convince myself it was normal. But then the whispers coalesced, forming a distorted mimic of Tyler's voice, calling me by my name, urging me closer. My stomach twisted, knowing full well the rule existed to prevent this precise situation. I couldn't answer, couldn't move, and yet my legs felt glued to the floor. I crept further into the room, every step deliberate, every breath shallow, counting the bolts on the floor to maintain focus. The whispers intensified with each foot I moved, layering into harmonics that made the metal beams resonate painfully against my skull. The air seemed to thicken around me, sticky and warm in the parts that the rig should have cooled, and the condensation formed tiny rivulets along the machinery. I felt as if invisible eyes were moving beneath the pipes, tracking my every gesture. The rhythm of the whispers grew almost musical, as if the rig itself was conducting a melody too dark to comprehend. Tyler's hand on my shoulder nearly made me jump, but I let it remain. His presence anchored me just enough to resist a panic I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the machinery groaned unnaturally, as if reacting to my presence. The hum became a low, resonating growl, and I saw shadows flicker across the walls that didn't match any physical object. I stopped walking, listening intently. The whispers shifted, turning sharper, more insistent, like someone or something was correcting me, guiding me to a spot I didn't want to be. I wanted to retreat, but each step back seemed to trigger vibrations beneath my boots, pulling me forward. I realized then that the rule existed not just to protect from sight, but to prevent interaction. Something beneath the grates had noticed me, and by entering this space after the whispers began, I had marked myself. A sudden gust of air slammed through the room, rattling pipes, and I saw something slither along the floor, not solid, not liquid, but moving with intent. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I shined it toward the motion, and the shadows quivered, merging with the shape. The whispers grew louder, forming syllables I could almost recognize as a warning, a threat, or a command. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My limbs shook violently, sweat rolling down my back, and yet I pressed forward, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The machinery's hum reached a peak, that made my teeth rattle, and I understood that the ocean's pressure wasn't the only danger. The rig itself had become part of whatever waited below. The shadows finally shifted, forming a distorted shape that mirrored my own, though it moved independently, tilting and stretching in impossible angles. I felt a rush of vertigo, thinking the room itself was bending toward me. Tyler grabbed my arm, whispering that we needed to leave, but I couldn't move. The whispers formed words I could barely make out, telling me not to turn, not to speak, not to breathe too loudly. I felt a presence brush past my back, cold and wet, as if something had just surfaced from below the grates. I stumbled forward, my flashlight catching the shape's reflection in the polished metal pipes. My reflection moved, but not quite like me, its eyes too dark, too wide, following my every twitch. I finally managed to back out of the room, dragging Tyler with me, the whispers receding just enough to allow our escape. We reached the outer corridor, and the noise from the machinery resumed its normal hum, almost as if nothing had happened. But Tyler didn't speak, didn't breathe normally. He sat on the floor against the wall, shivering. I knew we had both seen the same thing, and both understood that Rule 5 wasn't just a guideline, it was a lifeline. We never spoke about what we had seen that night, not aloud, but the rule haunted us, especially when we heard faint murmurs drifting from the machinery on subsequent shifts. From then on, I avoided the room entirely, waiting for someone else to take the risk. Some things I realized aren't meant to be understood, only survived. I learned Rule 6. Never ignore the shadows that move independently on deck. After a week of shifts that left me exhausted, haunted, and questioning everything I thought I knew about the ocean and the rig. That night, the wind was unusually calm, and the sea below reflected the platform's lights in long, distorted lines that twisted unnaturally. I had been warned by the supervisor during the day about this rule, emphasizing that it wasn't superstition. The shadows themselves could be as dangerous as the water or the machinery. I didn't fully understand why until the moment I saw one of them move on its own, stretching across the deck in a way that defied logic, almost as if it had a mind of its own. Tyler was with me, but even he fell silent, staring at the shadow as it slithered unnervingly toward the cargo hook. The deck felt alive that night, vibrating subtly under my boots. Each step I took echoed differently, the metal plates resonating with a dissonance that made my ears ring. I could see the shadows clinging to the edges of the railings, moving against the dim light from the deck lamps, sometimes retreating, sometimes advancing, but never aligning with any solid object. Tyler whispered, "It's just your eyes playing tricks," but I could see the fear in his voice, and it betrayed him. The shadow stretched over the floor, elongating unnaturally, curling around corners where nothing could cast it. I realized then that Rule 6 wasn't a suggestion. It was a protective measure, a boundary drawn between the living and the unseen forces that inhabited the rig. We tried to continue with our work, keeping the crane moving in careful, slow motions, but the shadows followed each cable swing. Every time the hook lowered or the cargo shifted, the shadows seemed to react, stretching and curling around objects as though studying us. One moment it appeared on the deck's surface, and the next it clung to the rig's steel frame above, defying any natural explanation. Tyler kept glancing at me, his lips pressed tight together, trying not to react too loudly, as if acknowledging the shadow might invite it closer. I felt my heart pound in sync with the machinery, each vibration through the metal plates alerting the moving darkness below. The whispers from the machinery room earlier in the week seemed to have followed us here, low and distant, merging with the shadow's movements. The worst part wasn't even the shape itself, it was the intent behind it. The shadows weren't random, they seemed to anticipate our actions, almost as if they were learning our routines, predicting where we would step next. One shadow, darker than the others, detached from its usual path and followed the cable of the crane, as if it could climb along metal. Tyler noticed it too, his jaw tightening, his grip on the railing white-knuckled. He whispered that it was watching us, and I knew he wasn't exaggerating. Every time we tried to focus on the cargo or the controls, The shadows danced along the edges of our vision, testing, probing, and keeping us on edge. I forced myself to breathe evenly, repeating the rules silently in my head. Never ignore the shadows that move independently on deck. Suddenly, one shadow lunged across the deck, not like a human would, but stretching fluidly, landing near the crane operator's console with a speed that made my stomach flip. Tyler jumped, knocking over a small toolbox that clattered against the deck, and the shadows recoiled for a second before advancing again. I froze, gripping the crane lever, watching as the darkness seemed to coil itself around the cables, as though it could manipulate the hook or the cargo itself. The rig shuddered under a sudden gust, but I realized the wind hadn't changed. The shadows were the ones moving the air, pushing it subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet it was enough to disturb our balance. I shouted at Tyler to focus on the crane, trying to keep both of us grounded in reality. The shadows' movements became more deliberate after that. One stretched upward along the crane's arm, nearly reaching the pulley at the top, then paused, waiting. I could see its edges ripple against the metal, not reflecting light the way normal shadows should. Tyler was frozen, staring at it as if hypnotized, and I felt a cold pressure in my chest, like the weight of something vast pressing down. The cargo hook swung slightly, though I hadn't touched the controls, and the shadows seemed to react, curling toward it and then recoiling. I realized in that moment that ignoring these moving shadows wasn't enough. They were interacting with the rig itself, testing limits, seeing how far they could push without breaking the rules we followed. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but the supervisor's voice echoed in my mind. Moving recklessly could draw attention, and once drawn, survival was unlikely. Tyler finally shook himself free from the trance, gripping my arm. "We need to move," he said, voice trembling. We slowly backed toward the stairwell leading to the interior, keeping our eyes on the shadows, counting each movement. One of them mimicked the way I held the crane lever, then the way Tyler's shoulder shifted. It was learning. I felt nauseous, realizing the rig's shadows weren't just dark patches. They were sentient extensions of whatever lurked below the water and the machinery. By the time we reached the stairwell, the shadows receded slightly, melting into the corners of the deck, but I knew they hadn't disappeared. They were waiting, silent now, but alert, watching for a chance to move again. Tyler didn't speak as we descended. He didn't need to. The rule had already impressed itself on both of us. Rule 6. Never ignore the shadows that move independently on deck, wasn't just a guideline anymore. It was a survival mandate. Any lapse in attention could mean being pulled into the water, dragged into the machinery, or trapped on the deck, while the shadows experimented with the next victim. When we reached the interior, I finally exhaled, but my chest felt tight, my nerves raw. I realized the shadows weren't bound by logic, light, or material. They existed in the spaces between the metal, the deck, and the water, and they could reach anywhere. I knew we had narrowly avoided catastrophe, and that ignoring them, even briefly, could have led to death. I glanced at Tyler, who nodded, pale and silent, and we both understood we couldn't ever underestimate this rule again. It wasn't just a warning, it was a boundary drawn between life and whatever darkness lay in wait. Even now, days later, I can't step onto the deck without scanning for their movement, counting the shadows, memorizing each angle, and reminding myself of Rule 6. The darkness there is patient, persistent, and intelligent. I don't know what it wants, only that it learns, observes, and punishes those who ignore it. If anyone tells you these are just tricks of the mind, I can't convince them. I only know what I saw, what we survived, and that the rule exists for a reason. No human mind is meant to question. I learned Rule 7. Never approach the portholes when the sea below is completely still during a night shift. That began with an unsettling quiet unlike anything I had ever experienced on the rig. The waves had flattened into glass, reflecting the deck lights in eerie stretched patterns, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I could hear my own heartbeat inside my helmet, each thump echoing in the empty corridors, as if emphasizing the rule. Tyler stayed close, unusually silent, his eyes flicking to every window, as though expecting something to emerge. The supervisor's warning about this rule felt different this time, urgent, almost pleading, but I didn't fully understand the danger until I glimpsed the surface beneath the porthole. The stillness of the ocean was unnatural. Usually, there's a subtle movement, a gentle swell, but tonight it was a mirror, unbroken, except for the reflections of the rig's lights. I could see every detail of the shadows stretching across the deck, and yet the water's surface offered nothing back. No ripples, no reflection of the waves, nothing human. It was that perfect stillness that made the portholes dangerous. I could almost hear the ocean calling through the glass, pulling at my attention. Tyler nudged me, whispering that he didn't like how quiet it was. But I didn't respond. My eyes were locked on the water below, fighting the urge to lean closer, to see what the calm might be hiding. As I stepped toward the first porthole, the air seemed to thicken around me. The rig's hum became muted, as though some external force absorbed the noise. I could feel my hair standing on end, and a chill ran down my spine, despite the heat in my suit. Tyler gripped my shoulder, warning me not to approach, but I could feel the compulsion tugging me forward. There was something beneath the surface, something aware of us above, and the still water gave it the perfect vantage. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't quite my own. It had subtle differences, a tilt of the head that I hadn't made, eyes darker, waiting. The whispers returned, faint at first, carried through the metal walls rather than the water, and I realized they weren't coming from the machinery room this time. They were coming from the ocean itself. Every syllable felt deliberate, like it was guiding me closer to the porthole. I forced myself to step back, reminding myself silently of Rule 7, but the calm water seemed to mock me, as if daring me to disobey. Tyler's breathing quickened beside me, and I could feel his fear radiating through his hands pressed against my arm. It wasn't just silence, it was expectation, a patient hunger beneath the mirrored surface that threatened to pull anyone foolish enough to linger too long. I tried to work, to distract myself with securing the rig's equipment, but the water was impossible to ignore. Every reflection of the deck, every flicker of light, seemed to distort in subtle ways, hinting at movement that didn't exist, or perhaps that I wasn't meant to see. Tyler whispered again, his voice trembling, that he thought he saw something moving beneath the still water, a ripple where there shouldn't be one. I told him it was impossible, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The ocean wasn't normal tonight, and whatever watched from beneath the glass knew we were looking, knew we were curious, knew that breaking Rule 7 could cost us more than fear. I stepped away from the portholes, but the water remained too still, too knowing. The shadows on the deck seemed to shift as if reacting to my movements, and a soft pressure filled the air around us. Tyler refused to approach any of the remaining windows, and I followed his lead, keeping my gaze fixed on the cargo and the controls. The stillness below wasn't passive, it was calculating, measuring, anticipating. My stomach twisted as I realized that if the water moved at all, we would never see it coming, and that perfect calm was far more dangerous than any storm. Even after retreating into the interior corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ocean had watched, studied, and remembered. The portholes reflected only darkness now, yet I could sense the presence beneath, waiting for the next opportunity. I understood why this rule existed. It wasn't just about caution, it was about survival, about resisting the almost irresistible draw of the mirrored water. Ignoring it meant inviting attention from something vast, patient, and utterly alien, something that could wait for hours or days before deciding to strike. That night, Tyler and I avoided the portholes completely, keeping our backs to the windows and focusing only on the rig's lights. We whispered little, afraid of drawing the attention of whatever lingered beneath. The water remained unnaturally still, the shadows stretched long and patient, and every nerve in my body told me that the calm was not normal, that it was bait. Rule 7, never approach the portholes when the sea below is completely still, had never felt more real, more critical. I knew that if we failed to respect it even once, the rig, the water, and the darkness below would not hesitate to claim us. I realized Rule 8, Never leave the main deck. During the second watch alone, the night it nearly cost me my life. The rig had fallen into an uneasy rhythm, the hum of the generators blending with the faint swell of the ocean below. Tyler had taken first watch with me earlier, but fatigue had driven him inside to rest, leaving me alone to manage the crane and check the cargo. The rule wasn't just a precaution, it was survival. Every operator before me had learned the hard way that leaving the main deck alone during the second watch invited something that didn't belong in the ocean, the shadows or the rig. I remembered the supervisor's warning clearly. Anyone alone in that time window had a much higher chance of disappearing without a trace. The deck was dimly lit, the lamps casting long, distorted shadows that moved strangely with the shifting lights. The calm of the night made the darkness seem thicker, almost solid, pressing against the metal surfaces. I kept my hands tightly gripping the crane controls, but my eyes couldn't resist scanning the far edges of the deck. The cargo hung precariously, swinging slightly in the subtle motion of the rig. A strange pressure filled the air, the kind that makes every movement feel heavy and deliberate. I could hear the water lapping against the rig's base, but it wasn't just normal waves. It sounded like something brushing along the steel legs, something that didn't belong. As I walked to adjust a stray cable, I felt the first brush of fear. The shadows shifted independently again, stretching unnaturally along the deck and the crane's cables. I felt watched, and the realization that I was alone pressed down on me like a weight. A faint whisper drifted across the wind, almost teasing, almost calling my name. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just the ocean or the machinery, but deep down I knew better. The second watch was always dangerous, the rig quieter, the crew asleep, leaving a solitary operator exposed to whatever lurked in the darkness. The rule was simple, yet its consequences were absolute. I continued across the deck cautiously, my flashlight barely piercing the thick shadows. Each step seemed amplified, echoing through the steel like a warning bell. Something moved in the corner of my eye, just a flicker, just a shift, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I reminded myself silently of Rule 8, telling myself not to panic, not to turn my head too quickly, not to draw attention. The crane groaned softly under the weight of the cargo, and I realized that even small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. I wanted to retreat to the interior, but something compelled me to finish the checks first, to obey the routine despite the fear crawling up my spine. Suddenly, a shadow detached from the edge of the deck and flowed toward the center, moving independently, and the air around me grew heavier. I could feel it pressing at my legs, testing my balance, and the whispers grew clearer, forming broken syllables that almost sounded like words. I clenched the crane's controls, keeping my focus on the cargo, but the sensation of being followed, being observed, was overwhelming. I realized the shadows were learning my patterns, predicting my moves, and that leaving the deck alone had allowed them to study me unopposed. The calmness of the second watch wasn't a blessing, it was bait. I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping the crane steady, but the pressure intensified. One of the shadows stretched toward the water's edge, hovering just above the surface, and I saw a pale, distorted reflection underneath, rippling in a way that made no sense. My stomach twisted. Tyler's absence felt heavier than ever. I reminded myself once more of Rule 8, and the words anchored me, forcing me to resist the urge to flee blindly. The cargo swung gently, a reminder that the physical dangers of the rig were real, but minor compared to what waited in the shadows, the water, and the spaces between. The whispers shifted tone, urgent now, and I realized I couldn't linger longer than necessary. By the time I returned the cargo to its platform, the shadows had receded slightly, retreating into the corners of the deck, but the threat lingered. My legs shook, my palms were slick with sweat, and my heart pounded with the memory of their presence. I knew the danger wasn't gone, it was patient, watching, waiting for the next operator to break the rule. Tyler emerged from the interior, bleary-eyed, muttering that he had never seen the deck so quiet and still. I didn't respond. We both understood that the rule wasn't just a guideline, it was survival, plain and simple. Leaving the main deck during the second watch alone wasn't a choice. It was an invitation for something that the ocean, the rig, and the darkness had patiently prepared for. Even after we locked up and retreated inside, the memory of the shadows followed me. I couldn't look at the crane without imagining them stretching across the cables. Every creak of metal, every whisper carried through the wind, reminded me of the rule's importance. Rule 8, never leave the main deck during the second watch alone, wasn't about superstition. It was about the invisible intelligent forces that lurked in silence, waiting for solitary operators to falter. From that night on, I never went anywhere alone during the second watch, and I kept a careful watch on the edges, knowing that survival depended on strict obedience to the rules, because breaking them could mean never returning. I learned Rule 9, never respond to voices calling from the cargo hold during a night shift that had already tested every ounce of my nerves. The rig had grown quieter than usual, the hum of the generators replaced by the occasional groan of metal, and the far-off lapping of waves against the steel legs. I had been inspecting the cargo on the lower deck when I first heard it, a faint, almost pleading voice whispering my name from deep within the hold. At first I thought it was Tyler joking, or my imagination playing tricks after weeks of long nights. But then the tone changed, urgent, familiar, and impossible to ignore. I froze, remembering the supervisor's warning that responding to these voices was forbidden. The cargo hold itself was a maze of crates, pipes, and steel beams, all dimly lit by flickering lamps. Shadows pooled in corners, twisted by the angles of the crates, and the air smelled of oil and damp metal. I could hear the voice again, clearer this time, echoing from between two stacks of machinery parts. It sounded exactly like Tyler, but I knew he was asleep in the interior. My chest tightened, and I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay put. The rule wasn't meant to be broken. Any response could draw something down from the depths, something patient and malevolent that knew how to mimic those it hunted. The whispers weren't innocent. They were traps. I edged closer to the hold's entrance, my boots clanging lightly against the metal floor, but every step seemed to amplify the sound of the voice. It shifted as I moved, now sounding like a plea, now a command, now a warning I couldn't understand. My mind raced, calculating whether I should retreat or investigate, and I felt the pressure of the rule in my mind. Rule 9 was there to protect me. I could almost feel a presence moving among the crates, invisible but palpably close, watching my every action. The air felt heavy, sticky, charged with something that made my skin crawl. I resisted the instinct to speak back, knowing that answering, even to deny, could be fatal. The voice grew louder, now urgent, almost desperate. My reflection in the polished metal of a crate showed a face pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear, and I realized the voice wasn't just auditory. It was psychological, probing for weakness. I kept moving slowly along the perimeter of the hold, flashlight sweeping the shadows in careful arcs. But every time the beam passed over empty space, it seemed to shift just out of reach. My palms were slick with sweat, and the crane's vibrations from above seemed muted, replaced by a low hum that matched the rhythm of my racing heartbeat. The hold had become a trap, a maze designed to test my compliance with the rule. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, securing crates for the next morning and ignoring the voice entirely. Every instinct urged me to answer, to respond, but I kept repeating the rule in my mind: never respond to voices calling from the cargo hold. The moment I acknowledged the sound, it grew stronger, more insistent, wrapping around me like cold fingers. I took deep, controlled breaths and continued my work, but the presence seemed to move closer with each step, the shadows stretching toward me as though testing my resolve. Tyler's absence weighed heavily. Without a partner nearby, I was entirely exposed to whatever the voices could manifest. At one point, a crate toppled on its own, the metal sliding across the floor, with a sound too deliberate to be accidental. The voice, now louder than before, seemed to laugh softly, echoing across the hold and intertwining with the mechanical groans of the rig. I froze, forcing myself not to speak, not to flinch, trying to remember that responding would be fatal. My hands shook as I picked up the crate, every movement a negotiation with the invisible presence that had claimed the space. It was patient, waiting for a single mistake, and I understood that survival depended entirely on discipline. By the time I left the cargo hold, the voice had receded, leaving only a heavy silence that felt thicker than the air outside. Tyler, who had woken and noticed my absence, didn't ask where I had been. He could see it in my face. The rule had proven its purpose. Ignoring the voice had allowed me to survive, but it had left a mark on my mind. I now understood that the cargo hold was not a storage space. It was a hunting ground for whatever lurked in the rig's shadows, and any interaction with it, even passive, was dangerous. The voices weren't random, they were calculated, learning which humans could be lured, which could resist. Even now, the sound of the hold creaking, the faint vibrations of crates shifting, brings back that same tension. I never approach it alone, and I never answer any sound, no matter how familiar. Rule 9. Never respond to voices calling from the cargo hold is no superstition, it is a boundary. Breaking it could mean vanishing into the darkness, or worse, joining the chorus of voices used to lure the next unwary operator. The rig, the ocean, and the shadows all seem to conspire to test obedience, and I have learned that following the rules is the only way to survive each night. I realized Rule 10, never trust the emergency lights when they flicker alone, during a night that began like any other, but quickly spiraled into pure terror. The rig's main power had been stable all day, and the hum of the generators provided the usual background rhythm. Yet something in the shadows felt off. As I patrolled the deck checking the cargo and crane mechanisms, I noticed a faint flicker from the emergency lights near the stairwell. At first I thought it was a malfunction, maybe a loose circuit or water intrusion, but a cold dread sank into my chest as I remembered the rule. Tyler had always joked about ignoring the lights, calling it superstition, but that night he followed silently, pale and tense, as if he too sensed the danger hidden behind the oscillating glow. The flickering lights were deceptive, rhythmically pulsing in ways that seemed deliberate rather than random. Each blink cast long, wavering shadows across the deck, making familiar structures appear unfamiliar, sinister and alive. My eyes traced the patterns cautiously, noting how the shadows elongated unnaturally, twisting around cables and railings in a way that seemed to have intent. The cargo hook swayed slightly, responding to some invisible force, as though the rig itself had become an extension of whatever lurked in the shadows. Tyler whispered, "It's not the power," but even his voice trembled, betraying the terror we were both feeling. The rule's importance crystallized in that moment. These lights weren't just indicators, they were warnings, sometimes traps, sometimes guides for forces beyond human comprehension. As I approached the source of the flicker, the air thickened, sticky and heavy, carrying a metallic scent that made my stomach churn. My flashlight bounced across the deck, revealing nothing yet hinting at movement where none should exist. The shadows shifted independently, responding to the flickering pulses, stretching toward the cables, the railing, the open cargo hatches. Tyler stayed close, but I could see his hand shaking, gripping mine in silent acknowledgement of the danger. I reminded myself silently of Rule 10, repeating the words as a mantra. Never trust them, never assume the lights are accidental. The flicker seemed almost conscious, adapting to our movements, testing our attention, measuring our fear. One flash of light illuminated the far end of the deck, and I saw a shape dark, featureless, shifting, that disappeared the moment the light blinked off. My heart pounded, and a cold sweat ran down my back. The rig groaned under a subtle wave, but the water below remained unnervingly still. I realized that the lights were creating illusions, stretching the shadows, amplifying the movements of the darkness around us. Tyler muttered that he saw something move closer, but I told him to stay silent. Any sound could invite it further. My mind raced, calculating every movement, every placement of my feet, every angle of the flashlight. The lights were manipulating perception, testing adherence to the rule, and I understood that breaking it could be fatal. The flickering continued, now faster, irregular, almost like a stutter. It drew our eyes repeatedly to the same spots, making the shadows seem to twist and writhe in impossible ways. The cargo hook swayed again, and I realized it had moved without contact, guided by something unseen responding to the rhythm of the lights. I forced myself to breathe slowly, focusing on the crane and deck alone, refusing to glance at any area illuminated by the flickering. The rule was clear, and it was the only defense against being lured into the traps the lights could create. Tyler mirrored my actions, pale but compliant, and we moved as a unit, careful not to break eye contact with the stable, unbroken areas of light. At one point, a series of flashes revealed a figure crouched by a railing, featureless, formless, but undeniably present. It vanished immediately as the light blinked off, leaving nothing but darkness and a sense of being observed. My stomach twisted as I felt the presence moving closer, pressing against the air, almost tangible, waiting for a misstep. The flickering had become a weapon, guiding the attention of something beyond us, something patient and intelligent. I kept repeating Rule 10, anchoring myself to the knowledge that any response, any glance at the wrong time, could draw it fully into our reality. The rule was a lifeline in that moment, a mental tether to survival. By the time the emergency lights stabilized, the tension had not lessened. The shadows remained elongated and restless, the presence lingering just beyond perception. Tyler and I retreated to the interior of the rig, but the knowledge of what we had faced remained, pressing down on our minds. The lights were not mechanical, they were intentional, a tool of something unseen, something that thrived on fear and compliance. Rule 10, never trust the emergency lights. When they flicker alone was no mere precaution. It was a commandment for survival. Breaking it, even once, could lead to being consumed by the darkness that the rig, the ocean, and the shadows conspired to unleash. Even now, whenever I see a flicker, my chest tightens and my limbs freeze. I know the lights have memory, that they can distort reality, draw attention, and manipulate perception. I have never looked at them casually again, and I never will. The rule is more than a guideline. It is a boundary that separates survival from disappearance, sanity from madness, light from the consuming shadows. Tyler understands it too, though neither of us speaks openly about what we witnessed. The rig, the flickering lights, the ocean, and the shadows all demand obedience, and Rule 10 is the line we cannot cross without risking everything. The first time I learned Rule 11, never answer a voice coming from a sealed compartment, I laughed it off like a rookie who thought he'd seen enough strange things to stop being surprised. But when you ride a submarine built older than your father and deeper than your fears, voices start showing up in places no voice should exist. My chief told me the rule while we were drifting at 3,000 meters, adjusting ballast tanks, when a faint tapping echoed behind a bulkhead that hadn't been opened in years. That was when I realized this rule isn't for discipline, it's for survival. The sealed compartments in our sub have a history older than any logbook. Some of them were welded shut before our vessel even got her name, marked only with faded paint and cryptic engineering stamps. I was told they were closed after pressure-related incidents, but the tone of the officers suggested there was more to it. Some compartments were cold to the touch, others strangely warm, and a few had the unsettling habit of vibrating subtly, like something inside them was anxious to get out. Those compartments became the parts of the boat we walked past quickly. It was during a silent running drill that I heard the voice myself, soft, tentative, like someone half afraid to ask a question. It called my name with a familiarity that froze the breath in my chest. The strangest part wasn't the sound of it. It was the cadence. It spoke exactly the way I do when I'm tired. For a moment my instincts betrayed me, and I nearly responded just to confirm what I was hearing. That's when the chief grabbed my sleeve so hard his nails dug in. He shook his head once, firmly, and mouthed Rule 11. I swallowed my answer and kept moving. The voice didn't stop. Each time we passed that compartment, it tried something new, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes perfectly calm. It shifted from whispering to humming to tapping rhythmically, as if desperate to provoke any kind of reaction. One night it mimicked my mother, her tone flawless, down to the slight crack she had when she worried. I almost broke. You don't expect your mother's voice to come from behind a steel wall 3 inches thick, pitch black, with no possible source of life inside. After that incident, senior crew briefed me on what they called compartment mimicry. According to them, the voices start simple, repeating a name or a sentence, almost like learning. The longer they go unanswered, the more articulate they become. Some officers think ignoring the voices frustrates them. Others think it teaches them, but everyone agrees on one thing. Acknowledging the voice gives it something: attention, leverage, permission no one can clearly explain. Those who answered, even once, were never quite the same afterward. I met one of those men during a crew transfer, an old sonar tech named Ramirez. He had the look of someone who'd spent years hearing things nobody believed. He told me he answered a voice 5 deployments ago, just a single word, "What?" Ever since then, he said, the voice followed him, even on land, even in crowded rooms. He said it never learned new words, only repeated the ones he spoke, slowly twisting them into questions he didn't want to hear. He told me he slept with music playing to drown it out, but even then, he sometimes heard it humming along. One mission later, we hit a region of the trench known for pressure anomalies, places where sound travels strangely and instruments glitch without warning. That's when the voices all changed. They stopped calling our names and started mimicking our reports, alarms, and even system readouts. The worst part was when one of the sealed compartments perfectly replicated the sound of a flooding alert. Half the crew sprinted before realizing nothing was wrong. The chief said this was when the voices became strategic, and that's when we doubled down on the rule. Then came the night the knocking started from 3 sealed compartments at once. First slow, then synchronized, like someone or something was moving through the boat behind the walls. At the same time, the voices began calling from different locations in perfect imitation of the crew, even duplicating the captain's voice in a tone so precise it made my spine crawl. To someone who didn't know the real captain was asleep in his rack, it would have been indistinguishable. That was the moment we initiated lockdown protocols. The deeper we descended, the more agitated the sealed compartments became. The steel around them groaned like it was under stress from the inside rather than the outside. At one point, one of the compartments bulged outward slightly, just enough for the metal to warp. The internal temperature spiked so fast that condensation turned to steam and frost formed around the edges as if the heat wasn't natural. Through it all, the voices kept speaking, begging us to open the door because someone inside was hurt, but we knew better. During the final 48 hours of the mission, everything escalated. Lights flickered whenever we passed certain compartments, and shadows appeared behind the reinforced glass portholes, even though the compartments were pitch black and sealed airtight. Every time the lights flickered back on, the shadows were gone, but the sensation of being watched lingered like a weight on our shoulders. We began traveling the corridors in pairs, speaking little and never stopping near a sealed area for more than a few seconds. On our ascent, just when we thought things were calming, the voice from the oldest compartment spoke again, this time perfectly matching the captain's command tone. It issued an order to open the compartment due to emergency crew entrapment. It was flawless, authoritative, convincing. If the real captain hadn't been standing beside us when we heard it, 3 men would have reached for the release wheel. Instead, we froze, staring at the metal door that should not have been able to vibrate the way it did. When we finally surfaced, the voices fell silent instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. No tapping, no whispers, no mimicry, just the groan of the hull adjusting to surface pressure. The compartments returned to being nothing more than sealed spaces, at least on the outside. But every man aboard knew the quiet wouldn't last. It never does. The deeper we go, the more attention we attract. And as long as those compartments remain part of our boat, the one rule none of us will ever break is the one that keeps us from giving whatever's inside exactly what it wants.